again, one of the many Jasons. Is there a Jason with an M4 Sherman question? All right. Many people depreciate the M4 Sherman as an obsolete vehicle, outclassed. Can you shed light on the origin of the Sherman and its relative quality? It won the war. I mean, what
yeah, well,
Yeah.
I wrote an entire book on that called Armored Thunderbolt. But the first point that I'd make is that once again, this is a time frame. There's a time frame at which the Sherman is, you could argue, is the best tank on the battlefield, and I think that in the later part of 1942, the early part of 43, it's certainly as good as any other tank on the battlefield. The problem that the Sherman faces is in that critical period from roughly the summer of 1943 to the autumn, winter of 1943, the U.S. Army had not cued in on the fact that it was going to face a much greater threat the next summer. If they had been more aware of the future threat, I think that they could have adopted changes on the Sherman, as the British did in the case of the 17-pounder. But there was this institutional blindness to the threat issue, and as a result, the Sherman during the summer, the following summer, didn't do as well as it could have done. Now, the second problem is it depends on who's using the Sherman. The folks who lost most of the Shermans in the summer of 1944 was not the U.S. Army, it was the British Army, partly because it bore the bulk of the tank fighting on the Allied front up in the Con sector. The U.S. Army, the use of the Sherman tank in the summer, yeah, there were U.S. tankers complaining about the poor performance of the Sherman against the Panther, but the number of times the Shermans confronted Panther until the Ardennes was very, very few. On the other hand, in the British sector, British Shermans were encountering Panthers in extremely large numbers. So it depends on the time frame, and it depends on the sector and what was going on. But the Sherman held up right through the war. And, you know, to reiterate my rant earlier, the Sherman was mostly firing HE against German troops and bunkers and trucks and other types of targets. Very effective in that role. So for the majority of combat, it was perfectly adequate. Facing the Panther, yeah, that's not an equal contest. But later in the war, it becomes equal just in the sense that the Allied crews tend to be fairly good, and the German crews are inexperienced, and the Panther doesn't do well in the Ardennes.
Well, if the Sherman was so bad, why was it still being used till 1973?
That gets into Middle East and arms supplies to Israel and those issues. And I mean, we can take it up separately.
Mark IV is still
I'll
being
leave
used.
I'll leave it up to David to talk about, you know, if he wants to talk about the British end of it.
No, all I was going to say, and I think this is general, doesn't necessarily concern the M4. I don't think it's the tank, I think it's the guys inside the tank that makes the difference, generally speaking. And I think that cuts right across the board.
And that actually answers the 1967 and 1973 question, because the reason that the Sherman remained viable in the Mideast was because of the Israeli tank crews, and not because of the technical quality or inferiority of the Sherman.
Well, a German vehicle that gets bad press is the Ferdinand Elefant. Everybody reads about how bad it was, no machine gun for close-in combat and so forth. However, that's completely wrong, because there are two different units had that. One was a former Sturmgeschütz unit. They were great. They really did devastation with those vehicles. The other unit was a Panzerjäger lads who were driving around with trucks with Pak 37s. And when they got them, they said they thought they were invulnerable, so they drove around thinking they were invulnerable, and they lost all their vehicles. So it's very much depending on who was using them. The Sturmgeschütz guys knew from 1940, 1941, and so how you stayed quiet, you waited, and you took out the target. You didn't go driving around in this big armored fortress.
Okay. Post-war designs, or at least World War II designs, that are kind of, shall we say, throwbacks to World War I. I mean, the one obviously is TOG, and then there's ARL 44, which also seems to be kind of a throwback. What was the thing behind those?
Well, the thinking behind TOG was exactly as Nicholas says. It was, TOG stands for the old gang, and these were the guys who had designed the first tanks in 1915-16. They come back under Albert Stern thinking that they're going to set the world alight with a super new tank, but they are still believing in terms of a Western front with fixed defences, and TOG is designed to operate in that environment. That never happened. The tank was a total waste of time, but they didn't know that at the time.
The French one, the ARL 44, is just a it's an aberration, because what happened was, of course, the French tank industry completely collapsed, obviously, after the defeat in 1940. If any of you want to look at some futuristic 1940 designs, if you pick up the new French magazine GBM, they have some wonderful articles in the follow-on to Char B, like there was a Char G, very, very advanced design, obviously never went beyond wooden mock. Well, actually, I take it back. There were a few metal prototypes, some of them. But the ARL-44 was an attempt to revive the French tank industry in 1944. The problem is that they didn't have any money, they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the engineers, and so if you look at the design, you can see what it is. It's a revived Char B1 bis with a new turret with a larger, more effective gun, getting rid of the hull-mounted gun and going to a turret-mounted gun. But it's a very short-lived program. They dump it rather quickly, go over to two very futuristic designs, the AMX-13, which you see out here, which you have to keep in mind is a late 1940s design, and the AMX-50, which is a very snazzy-looking tank with an oscillating turret and a massive gun and all sorts of horsepower and stuff, but which is beyond the state of the art of the technology of the time, and it flops. But AMX-13 was one of the most commonly manufactured and most widely distributed tanks of the 1950s. It went very, very well in the export market.
So as well, you kind of got two questions. One is the importance of getting the shot off first, and then you have the speed of reload for subsequent shots if required.
And the importance of the accuracy and the effect of the first shot versus the second. People always ask about tank-on-tank battle, what happens, and maybe you guys could just share with us briefly that scenario.
Well, as far as I know, I mean, certainly the accuracy of the weapons in World War II was very poor. So, I mean, if you were lucky, you might hit something, but you need a lot more than one shot to get anything. I think there was at one stage but I can't remember at which stage it was. They were using roughly 18 rounds in a German gun to hit a target.
There was operations research done at the very end of the war. The British Army started it, the U.S. Army tried to pile on top of it. Then the U.S. Army did it again in Korea, where they tried to study the whole issue of what's the most important in a tank engagement. Can we mathematically determine what the most important factor is? And the end result was who sees first, who fires first, generally wins. And there's statistical information in those operational research reports which indicates that. And there's certain things that can be drawn off it. I think you're mostly interested in the very narrow technical, I mean or tactical in the sense of one tank on one tank. But their point of view was that the absolutely most essential thing was to see the enemy tank, because the crew would be prepared. It wasn't even the issue of firing and then firing again. The situational awareness of knowing that the enemy tank was there was more important, because the commander could then cue the other members of the crew, and they could get the whole crew interaction going. Whereas in the case of a tank which does not see the enemy, the opposite occurs. They're simply coming down. They're apt to be the first ones hit, because obviously the other guy spotted you first. And then once you're hit, either A, number one, you're knocked out, or B, number two, you're heavily damaged. So there's a very good chance that you're never going to get a shot at all. And then if you are hit and you do survive, there's a very good chance that your crew is going to be disrupted. And if your crew is disrupted, therefore you probably are not going to get off a hit before the other guy gets a second chance at you. So the argument, at least from operational research the standpoint, is that finding the other guy first is the most important. And so that brings up some other lessons that could be learned, or some other things that could be suggested. And that is that tanks fighting from defensive positions, from a static position, have a much higher probability of succeeding in an engagement, and that's what they found. When they studied it, they found that stationary tanks that are in a defensive position, accepting combat from an advancing enemy force, are apt to have a very, very significant battlefield advantage, because they are stationary, they see the enemy tank coming in, the moving tank is less apt to see them.
Well, that, and they also, if their commanding officer has any sense, he's done EA development, he has already ranged. That bush is 800 yards away, so you already know how far away your target is. Now, I know the Israelis did also a study, came up with more or less the same conclusion. Whoever fires the first shot, and it doesn't matter if it hits or not, just get the first shot off, because A, it's a sensing round, so you can adjust your range off of it. And secondly, even if the only function it is to make the other tank aware of your presence, he is going to be getting shot at is what you would call a significant emotional event. You used the word disrupted. I would say scared bleepless. And they are going to be so rushed to try to get a shot back off, there's almost no chance that they're going to hit you.
Yeah.
So you can afford to take the first shot and then take the second shot. With respect to autoloaders, I know you said the Germans were playing with the autoloaders and the French didn't get it to work. I mean, the fact, I guess the main problem was that they couldn't get it to work, so any theoretical benefit was irrelevant.
Yeah, it just hadn't matured. The technology wasn't available.
If I can put in just a little comment from the aircraft side, Hilary's probably aware of this, but just to point it out to our audience here, the Germans actually did have an autoloader on the 5-centimeter anti-tank gun, except that it was mounted in an aircraft.
The Henschel, wasn't it?
No, in the Me-410 heavy interceptor, the heavy fighter, they did mount a number of, essentially the equivalent of the PAC-38 5-centimeter anti-tank gun. They had an autoloader on that. It was an anti-bomber weapon. It wasn't designed for hunting tanks. It was designed to fly against B-17s and shoot at them. The autoloader in that was hideous. It simply didn't work. It would usually get one round off and then jam.
Cold War era autoloaders, they're getting better.
The AMX-13 out here has an autoloader.
But have you seen the operation of it? It's kind of one of the most bizarre operations you've ever seen. But anyway.
Steve mentioned about waiting in defense. That actually is part of the complete success of the Sturmgeschütz because it had a very high kill ratio, but of its nature it couldn't run around because it didn't have this rotating turret. So those guys knew how to hide and stay quiet and wait their time, and the success came to them.
Okay, topic change onto the British logistics or procurement system, I guess, for lack of a better term. So, you got 303s in one vehicle, and then you got right next to them the 7.92 BISA, which is a bit of an odd caliber. You had the HE rounds weren't being properly distributed to the tanks. What was going on?
I think two things. For a start, with the machine guns are concerned, once the British Army had standardised on the BISA as the hull-mounted and coaxial machine gun for our tanks, we were committed to that range of ammo. They did a 7.92 and a 15mm version. That did not match up with the infantry, and it's interesting in view of the experience in World War I, where if a tank was disabled, they used to dish out their machine gun ammo to the infantry to keep them fighting. So in that sense it's odd, but I suppose it's just one of those things. They'd elected to use this weapon. The BISA is not a good field weapon. You can tripod mount it, but it's a clumsy, horrible thing to use. And it works a lot better in a tank. As for the other thing, there were two factors here. There is a HE round for the 2-pounder, and there is HE for the 6-pounder. The 2-pounder is not exactly something going to set the world on fire. It might take your toe off if you're really unlucky, but that's about the limit. But the thing to remember is that the British philosophy, right up until virtually Alamein, is that the tank is a weapon equipped with a gun for taking out other tanks. A solid shot was the order of the day. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't use HE in our tanks, they used smoke, because that was perceived to be the ideal close support round. So it was with the gun tanks up until those of the 6-pounder, that a solid shot was the answer. And one thing you'll find if you follow the Desert War is that the tank crews start crying out for a dual-purpose weapon, that is something with an AP and an HE facility, simply because of the way the Germans operated mixed tank and anti-tank guns. And of course the first tank we had that really had that capability is the M3 with the hull-mounted 75. It meant that you could take on enemy tanks with reasonable chance of knocking them out, or blow away anti-tank guns if you had to. So it's very much more a question of practice at the time, perhaps rather than anything that you and I would think more logical.
All right, next one. Were amphibious tanks effective?
They were effective at their job. I mean, an amphibious tank, well, first, let's break it into two categories. There are amphibian tanks, which were used in the Pacific which were built like boats, light, thin armor, half an inch of armor. I mentioned earlier the LVTA-4 with the 75 millimeter howitzer, LVTA-1 with the, essentially with the Stuart turret on top of it. Also had what they called scarf guns in the back deck, which were machine guns with a crewman popping out of the hull. And then amphibious tanks, the most famous being the DD tanks used at Normandy. The amphibian tanks in the Pacific only operated in the Central Pacific area. It's kind of interesting. They waged two different wars in the Pacific. The Southwest Pacific area didn't even start getting tank battalions until 1944, and their amphibious operations looked more or less like the things you'd see in the Atlantic Mediterranean area, where they'd land infantry and bring in standard tanks as close behind them as they could. The amphibian tanks, however, actually landed before any infantry. They led the assault. They fired as they came in, and the idea was that they would continue to push in. And as things developed, the landings on Kwajalein, which were the first large-scale use of these things, convinced folks that the amphibian tanks were too lightly armored to play the role of a main battle tank, that they could be effective if they supported regular tanks once they landed. And this led over the course of a couple of years to a developing belief. There was no doctrine for the use of amphibian tanks because we'd never used them before, but a growing belief that once you got howitzer-armed amphibian tanks to shore, you cleared the beach, that you'd start using them as artillery. But what happened in practice was, time and again, once the amphibians were ashore, they wound up having to continue fighting. Like on Saipan, they remained in action for 11 days. So anyway, they were effective at their stated mission, and I guess they turned out to be less so in the land role. The DD tank was obviously effective, except if you had more than 3 feet of swell, it would sink. And
Minor glitch.
Minor glitch, and you know, off Omaha Beach, we did lose most of a tank battalion. I looked at the loss rates for the 708th Amphibian Tank Battalion on Saipan and the 743rd Tank Battalion at Normandy on Omaha Beach, landings that took place within 2 weeks of each other. And it turned out that both on D-Day and the subsequent 2 weeks or so, both units suffered roughly the same loss rate, 15% or so. Total losses, twice that, and if you add the badly damaged. Yeah, the opposition was a bit different. The Germans had more big stuff, but on Saipan, the Japanese were using 90 millimeter, 120 millimeter guns, and the attrition rate of tanks there, regular tanks, was as high as it ever was in Europe. So, you know, just based on the numbers, they I think, did the job.
We have to remember the first armored amphibians, we called them in the Marine Corps, we never called them amphibious tanks, were armed with 37 millimeter guns. Therefore, they had no business going inland, at least in the Kwajalein campaign. They mostly tried to stay in the water to keep their silhouette down. They did lead the assault waves, and of course, they didn't have to leave the water in order to clear away beach defenses. We don't get a 75 millimeter, it's a pack howitzer, of course, armored amphibian until Saipan time frame, and then but we still have the majority of them with 37 millimeter guns. The landing plan, unfortunately, at Saipan called for all of the Amtraks, personnel carriers and armored amphibians to continue in to the 1,000 yards from the water's edge. The first attempt to do kind of an amphibious maneuver. This resulted in unusually high Amtrak casualties, both the troop carriers and the armed amphibians. So they were exposed, perhaps unnecessarily, to Japanese anti-tank guns, 37 millimeter, for instance, that wouldn't have bothered the M4s at all. So it was an attempt. What it did do, though, was solve the problem of the water's edge, which at Tarawa almost cost us an entire regiment of infantry because we simply didn't have the firepower, couldn't generate the firepower at the water's edge to get the troops off the beach. So they were successful in correcting that particular problem. But of course, the Japanese defense system changed by 1944-45 as well.
Yeah. And the Marine tankers and the Amtrak guys, which were both Marine and Army, well, let's see. Well, yeah, but
Saipan, it's two Marine divisions
the fourth
landing.
division landed on the right, second on the left.
Yeah, two Marine
that right?
divisions land at Saipan, and the Army battalions are supporting the 2nd Division.
Yeah, and the 4th Division, when they came ashore, they found a bank, a high bank with trees just past the beach line, and they all got trapped down on the beach, while the Army tankers were able to move inland. So yeah, it was. They hadn't done adequate reconnaissance for use of the platform.
That was rarely possible.
Ahead of time, you have to ask for maps from the Japanese. All right, question, the viewers in the UK probably want this one. The first tank to have a boiling vessel.
You better explain to the American audience what a boiling vessel
Probably
is.
the most important piece of equipment on a British tank. All it simply is, in its simplest form, which came in with Centurion, was round container, very much like a saucepan, with a kettle heating element in it. This was plugged into the firewall, and it enabled you to boil water to make a cup of coffee, or you could put your tins of rations in there to cook it. The only problem on Centurion and Conqueror was as the turret moved round, your boiling vessel stayed there, and you couldn't get near it. It also had the habit of jumping out of its bracket, extending the cable and getting wrapped round. So you got your turret jammed, you lost your rations, you lost your drink, and more importantly, you lost the boiling vessel. But we persevered, as we normally do, and we came up with an absolute stunning design. So stunning that we became the envy of the world in tank design with this boiling vessel. It's mounted on the turret wall on Chieftain and on Challenger 1 and on Challenger 2. And all it consists of basically is a box, electrical connection, an inner container. And you can have the choice of either filling the whole container up with 8 pints of water and making a big brew, or you can put the amount of water in, then put the inner and decant your food into that. Very much like a bain-marie in a kitchen. The most important thing, though, is constant hot water. And showing that us tankies are very soft-hearted and subtle people, what you would normally do is stop, especially near a trench, you make your brew, the loader would open his hatches, lean over the tank commander and say, "Sir, do we need all this hot water or shall I get rid of it?" "Oh, get rid of it." And out went 8 pints of water to the chagrin of the infantry guys who were trying to light a little disposable stove.
Excellent.
You then look round and say, "Sorry, shut your hatches and go and have your
You will be glad to know there is in the back of my Bradley. We issued new Bradleys there about 6 months ago. There is, I'm not joking, a boiling vessel right next to the back ramp. We have learned. We have caught up. It took us decades. We have caught up. And the Abrams has one now as well. It's by the loader's feet.